It's a tremendous honor to be here with this audience. It's both an honor and a little intimidating because I don't need to come to this group and convince you that there's an issue with the achievement gap. You've been focused on this as a group for 10 years, but I think for so many of you for a lifetime. So what I want to do hopefully is to have a really good engaged discussion and hopefully tap some of the brain power in this room and see how we can continue to align and work together. It's an honor to be here with everyone. It is obviously an incredible honor to be here with Mayor Fraser, who has set the gold standard that will probably never be beat about how to use a mayor's office to hold up the whole goal of making sure that every young person is celebrated and challenged and thrives in this community. So the mayor has been a remarkable inspiration to me and to so many others, and it's pretty incredible, Mayor, that you didn't just do that when you were mayor. You did it for a whole long time before that, and you continue to do it, and it means a ton to this community, so thank you. I will also not portray myself as the educator in the room. I will say that right now I am privileged to be in a position to try to deal with alignment. There are people like Dick Mammon who chairs a school board. There are people I can look around this room, people doing great work. But what, as I said, I think is important is for us to hopefully find a way to think about how do we work together on the ecosystem we have. So let's start by grounding ourselves in the reality of the situation. And again, this group doesn't really need any statistics put in front of them other than the fact that the fact that if you look at every single country every single community in the United States of America, there is no other community where it is as likely that you can determine the likelihood of a child's success by looking at their race as this one. No other place in the country is race as likely a predictor of success as in this one, and that is something that we should always pause on. It's not new news to this group. You've been working on it for a long time. I fully understand that, and I respect that, but we should never let that statistic just wash by us. We have to really internalize that, and I'm as difficult as that is, I'm happy it weighs heavily on the shoulders of the people in this room, and I'm incredibly proud to be in a community where so many people have done something about it. But what are we going to continue to do about it? Because there are successes out there. There are things that aren't working as well, but what are we going to do about that? Well, the first thing we have to do is to not fall into the cynicism and the defeatism that I think people often do with this incredible challenge. I think this community that has challenged so many remarkable things collectively needs to first up believe that we can actually win in this. And I honestly am not able to say that I think this community believes this can be solved right now. And that, I think, is our very first challenge, is that we really have to say, can we in fact solve this, which I believe is the largest issue in this community. I believe we can, but I think part of that has to be that we've got to find a way to organize and focus our work on, and in doing that, I hold up an analogy that is abstract and may seem a little bizarre, but I think it's helpful in thinking about how we develop a master plan on this. I want you to think of a log jam on a river. I want you to think of, in the early days of St. Anthony Village or in Pig's Eye, all the logs are coming down the river, and the logs have come down the river and they've become jammed, and they are clanging up against each other, and there's all sorts of energy in all of that, and it's threatening the community. The water is backing up, the town may become flooded, and this log jam is a huge challenge. And there were two ways of going about that. You can stand in the back of that and try to get boats and everybody in town and just to push as hard as you can. But as you know, if you do that, it's probably just going to get worse. The way to get rid of that log jam is to find, say, 5 key logs and strategically remove the 5 key logs. And when you do that, suddenly all those logs align and almost like a flume go down the river together. All that energy that had been fighting each other aligns and moves. I use that analogy because that has been very helpful to me in recent weeks as I've thought about that as a way to really think about how do we organize our work. The 5 key logs we want to move are pretty simple, and you mentioned them at the start. There's no rocket science to them. We want every child ready for kindergarten, every child mastering reading by 3rd grade, every child mastering the math standards by 8th grade, graduating from high school, and not just graduating, college and career ready, and we want every child to have post-secondary certification, a college degree or something else. There's no rocket science to that. But how do we really then dive into that and figure out what do we do in that? So the first thing we do is, in our mind, is put together the right people at the table. So that involves 3 different tiers. First off, one of the reasons I was attracted to Generation Next in the first place is that growing out of the African American Leadership Forum where it started, and then with the University of Minnesota through Dr. Robert Jones, they came out in the community, and when I sat in the mayor's chair, when other people leading foundations, they were approached, and together a pretty darn good table was put together of people who could move the dial. Superintendents, mayors, county commissioners, all the major foundations. That was many of the leaders of businesses that are engaged in this work, like Target and Cargill and 3M and General Mills. So all of that table was put together. They then looked at a model that had come out of Cincinnati, which was a community engagement model that really developed some common approaches to some of those key issues. And no approach that's done in another city should come here as if it's a franchise. But it's a pretty good body of learning that's been enhanced by looking at what's happened in many other cities. No city in America has solved the achievement gap, but there's some good progress out there. And so collectively, that table that knew how to move the dial also began to engage communities, and a couple hundred people were engaged in all of that work. When I sat on the board, I was very happy with the engagement that was taking place, but frankly, I was the guy pounding the table saying, we've got to move to action. This is a crisis. We have to stop talking and move. And so when I stopped being mayor and I was approached to run this, I thought it was sort of poetic justice that they said to the loudmouth who thought you could solve this, okay, clown, you go walk in and figure it out. So that was the challenge that I walked into, and I think everyone deserves to have that done to them at least once in their life, and that's a good thing. But I was taken aback by it at first, but grabbed it because I think the infrastructure was very much there. But the very first thing I did was to recognize that when you're trying to get the right people to the table, and you'll never be able to get everybody to the table, but there was a very, very clear missing ingredient in all of that. This incredibly important work is often being undertaken by rooms filled with really intentioned white folk talking about a lot of other parts of the community. And that is a part of the issue, but there has to be dramatically better engagement of the communities most impacted by this work. So one of the staff changes we made is we added a position for a wonderful guy named Jeremiah Ellis, whose job is to direct our community outreach and engagement. And in partnership with him, we are now spending a lot of time doing very grassroots organizing on top of that, meeting with African American ministers, going out and figuring out which group is best able to engage Somalis in out-of-school reading. What are the Latino approaches? How does the Hmong community react? In what way? And beginning to make sure that we're doing a lot of that. So if you think about speaking truth to power, part of our job in putting that together is with the funding and the political community, with the wide network of people who are providing services, who we convene several hundred of them now through our networks, through the communities most impacted. Our job is to have grassroots, grass tops, and a lot of things in between. So that's the coalition that's put together. Then the idea is, as we convene those groups, to really look at those 5 outcomes and say, okay, what matters most? What are the logs that are moved? So let's start with early childhood. Certainly Mayor Fraser and certainly Todd Otis and many of the other people in this room have been engaged in this work for a long, long time. And I would say of any of these areas we work in, it's the richest part of what we have in this community. Our job wasn't to determine what is the most important thing to do in early childhood. That, I believe, has already well underway with many, many things on many, many levels, including the great work that came out of the Capitol and what the governor and the legislature have done. But our job was to look at where is the biggest gap that can have the biggest impact. And as we looked at all that in early childhood, we came to the conclusion, not just us, but those several hundred people, and then especially with people who are deeply engaged in that work, the biggest gap appeared to be screening every 3-year-old. Now, if you ask me what is the most important age to screen a child, and it's not just me, but talking to a lot of the others, it would be younger than that. it's incredibly important to do that. It's also incredibly important right before the school year, and by that time we're getting like 70 to 80% of the kids screened. But 3 is sort of a magic gap that we have in the community. It's a sweet spot of opportunity because it's old enough to see different issues begin to develop and yet young enough to do something about it. And so we set about, with the wind in our sails from all of these different folks agreeing that that was the place to focus, to really do the nuts and bolts work that is not fun, that is really in the weeds, but is really critical. How do we make sure that every child gets screened? So the example that we held up when we walked this out in public, and I think it's just a good one to get our hands around, is a pretty straightforward one. A woman with twins talked about the fact that one of the twins, she was a little worried about. The child wasn't communicating as well. She thought there was an emotional issue or a cognitive issue, and so she got the child screened, and actually that wasn't true. She had a speech impediment. And so the child went through therapy, and by the time she was in kindergarten, she was ready. There was no mistaking whether she was ready when she saw that kindergarten teacher. Imagine what would have happened, however, if that hadn't happened. Just walk through the kindergarten years with that child, not able to get their words across. That may have affected their view of themselves. It may have affected how the teacher perceived them. They may have been put in a program in some way. Many other things would have happened. Isn't that wonderful that that child was screened and action was taken before she started school? Now internalize the fact that there are 8,000 3-year-olds in Minneapolis and St. Paul schools who are not screened. That's not because people aren't doing their work. There's phenomenal work going on. But if there are 8,000 opportunities to intervene before these children start school, and you recognize that those fall disproportionately among communities of color, that is not the most important thing we can do in early childhood, but it is a gap in the current system where we have great opportunity. So the nuts and bolts work that we're doing involves working with the school districts, working with healthcare systems, looking at the whole issue of what do we mean by screening. It means what questions do we ask? How do we create a common approach across all those areas? What is Ramsey County Head Start doing versus Head Start across the river, et cetera, and just doing the real tough, in the weeds, blocking and tackling of trying to connect those dots. So that's where we're starting in early childhood. Again, not the most important thing to do, but the biggest gap with the biggest impact. What is the key log in that area? We then moved into the area of reading and mastering reading by 3rd grade. Now, of course, we all recognize that we're not just talking about mastering reading by 3rd grade. Doesn't mean how do we read in 3rd grade. Reading, of course, begins at birth and moves all the way through. It's language development, it's skill development, and many other things. In this case, what we did was first say that we're going to convene all of the literacy partners. There are some wonderful ones in this community, but they come across many different skill levels and they give many different instructions. Some are deeply engaged in training the many people who go into our schools to read, and some aren't. And so what we're doing is trying to come up with a common protocol among all of those tutors so that then when they go into school, if you have 90% of the answer and you have 10% of the answer, our kids have 100% of the answer. And so that work of unifying all of the out-of-school interventions is mirrored in our 3rd area in high school graduation, which takes the many great organizations that are involved in trying to help our children graduate. Project Success, Step Up, Genesis Works. I can go through this whole laundry list. So they're all working together. So in our 2nd and 3rd goals, we're unifying all of these out-of-school players and then connecting them with the school districts. And when I say school districts, we work both with Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools and also with charters. So it's easier to work with the school district, but we are also doing that with the many other charters as well, but trying to intervene, connect all of these out-of-school interventions. Then once we identify those 3 areas that we're working in, we also are going to intensify that work in 6 key schools. So we're picking 2 elementaries in each district, an elementary in each district, and a high school in each district, and then 2 charter schools. So 6 schools where we're especially going to dig in to try to do really intensive learning. These schools were chosen in the case of the district schools with the districts very much in mind, but also trying to get a cross-section of different populations. We wanted to really look at our work in depth in schools that had a wide range of populations. So for instance, one we're working in St. Paul is Maxfield, that has a large African American population. One we're working in Minneapolis is Lyndale. Lyndale is a very interesting school because it has basically the largest three populations there are middle and upper middle class white families, and two communities at a higher level of poverty, one being Latino, one being Somali. So then what we do is we really dig down and try to look at the data within those to tell us what are we learning about these schools. Well, one of the things we learn about that school is considering the poverty rate, it has surprisingly low mobility. So we dig into all that and say, okay, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that we may be able to do, in a place where there's a large achievement gap among the communities of color, some geographically specific interventions that would be more successful than a place with more mobility. So we're looking at, for instance, what approach would work best with Somali parents at for instance, a nearby public high-rise and a couple other issues like that. And we're going to do that diagnostic on each of these schools and try to learn from each of those. Too many people just talk about learning on these approaches. Our job is to learn and act and bring to scale as quickly as possible. One of the things that we learned in all of that is at Lyndale School, they've had a really good bump in reading in the past couple of years, and that's pretty interesting. It happens to correlate with the same time at which, instead of having 4 third grade classes, if I've got my numbers exactly right, they did 3 and took one of the teachers to be a reading instructor who moved across all areas. Is that what we should credit that with or not? We're looking at that. So while we're doing that, we also are developing capacity to be able to, in a much richer way, be able to really use data to help determine what's working or not. Is that the right intervention, and what are the other issues? This has been an especially difficult program because we're blessed with all of these out-of-school partners. And we're blessed with schools that right now, I feel very strongly, are looking very hard at doing the right thing and moving far on this. But the connection between what works or not is difficult. So what we've done on that is that we're co-funding data positions in both school districts. So what that means is in Minneapolis, with the help of United Way, and in St. Paul, with the help of philanthropy partners, the data directors, who both, by the way, in both districts right now are excellent, we're funding an additional staff person there. And we're saying in general, just take more help. But we are looking for some outcomes. One, help us measure which ready for school programs are actually getting our kids most ready for school. Who's coming to school ready to learn, and what program are they coming out of, so we know that. Which reading interventions are most effective? And then which of these out-of-school graduation partners are most effective, and how do we learn from them? And we modeled this on something that was done in Cincinnati with the Strive model that really allowed the community partners in the district to be able to work together through that, and frankly, had this outside partner be a little bit more of the bad guy if they had to be with all of these community partners. Many, and Dick, I imagine in the schools, you know this, lots of people want to help, and isn't that phenomenal? And don't we need to, if the district's trying to teach kids and the principal's trying to run the school and the teacher's trying to run the classroom, shouldn't we be able to give them some help and guidance about more of this? This is the most effective. So that's what we're trying to do. It was done very well before we got involved with a great out-of-school partner, Project Success. Does anybody know Project Success in this community? I have always had a very high regard for them. I saw their statistics. As a mayor, I was in the same position many of you are in. Different groups with different metrics from different places come in, and it all looks kind of good to me, you know. But what they did is they took 6,000 student IDs, turned them over to the district, and said, here are 6,000 students who've been in our program. You tell us whether we're moving the dial on graduation. And Eric, moreover, Minneapolis Schools came back with a very clear assessment. Project Success is moving the dial on graduation. Well, the principal of a school needs to know that. The teacher in the classroom needs to know it. The family and the student need to know that. So using that model, we're then working with all of these organizations that we're working with and saying, give us the data and let's model that and use this new position in district schools to be able to get that done. And because we're funding it in the schools and not outside of the schools, we have somewhat more latitude with student level ID, and we're able to get some granularity about what's working or not. Now, that's not magic in itself, but it is an approach that we think is going to help. So if you really look at all of this, what you see is us doing work that's trying to unify these partners, figuring out these 3 actions in these 3 areas for reading, for early childhood, for reading and high school graduation. We'll be coming back in the next few months with beginning our approach on math and college graduation. We're then using these data positions to help determine what works best. We're then going into specific schools to enhance that, not to just help those specific schools, although we do, but then to hold that up as for the whole to replicate as quickly as possible. The final point is to go back to that core issue of the funding table that we've convened. We've convened a funding table that represents, crosses many different boundaries, and we also want to do more alignment of their funding priorities along the lines of what's working or not. So for instance, United Way is now coming out with a multi-million-dollar grant in education. And so I will sit on the table that helps assess that. Our whole team and our data team will be part of having an impact on that and bringing our work into that. So it's United Way aligning with Generation Next. At our announcement in August, Target came out with something called the Bright Spots Initiative, where they're putting an additional $1 million out to 10 organizations to expand bright spots, and we'll have an influence on that. We're trying to get the funders to move more aggressively together. We are really blessed with a lot of good funders in this community, but again, alignment matters quite a bit. If you take that down to the basic work on all that, that's a lot about fixing gaps. Before I open it up, though, I really want to put this within the context of 2 other things that we think are critically important as we do this. And we call them contributing factors, but I think they're as critical as anything we've talked about. One of those is, along with what we're doing on basic data, is to hold up the social and emotional health of our children. We are especially focused on resilience and grit in the middle years. And what is it about that kid who's got all the odds stacked against them, and somehow they succeed? And I've, unfortunately been in a lot of situations where kids were put in really tough situations, and invariably there will be this child who somehow can make it. What is that resilience and grit, and how do we nurture that, and how do we enhance that the very best we can? So that's something we're looking very hard at. The final point is, to me, probably the most important way for us to look at the achievement gap. While this is very much about a deficit that we have, and it should be, I think, the shame of this community, there is an asset within what is happening with our population. Our population is rapidly diversifying, and in fact, our diversity in this community is far more diverse than other places. I was just in Denver, where there's a very large Anglo and a very large Latino population. Our situation is different. Because we've been a humanitarian center for so long, because we have welcomed people from conflict from around the world, and a whole lot of other reasons, including our incredible support system, we have a global population. This is a challenge, and this is absolutely, unquestionably, the greatest single asset that we have right now to become the global powerhouse we aspire to be. I was doing a United Way pitch out at Land O'Lakes a couple weeks ago. Land O'Lakes is moving into Africa. As you look at the Land O'Lakes workforce, and they are doing really mind-bogglingly good work at Land O'Lakes. It's a really great company right now. But that workforce is going to go into Africa, not looking like Africa, okay? The fact of the matter is, what we have right now, if I came up with some brilliant idea to take 50 kids in this community and train them in different African languages and dialects and send them out to Land O'Lakes, you'd think I was a genius. We don't have to do that. We have thousands of kids in this community, thousands, who speak every language and dialect of the African continent. Africa is being dominated right now by China, which recognizes the opportunity that is taking place. The United States is slipping and slipping and slipping in Africa, and what is the antidote to the United States getting beat by China in Africa? It's called Minneapolis, St. Paul, okay? There's no question about it. And that's not an abstract issue anymore. That was something that was kind of a theory 15 years ago, and it's a complete, total reality right now. What that means is something very different about how we look at this achievement gap. We have a tendency to talk about it like this. Here is the white population, here's everybody else, and what we need to do is to get all these people up to where these people are. Well, the fact of the matter is there's a piece of the statistics that is correct about that. But the reality is this kid, who may think they're up here, has to get over here, okay? And we all do. Every kid in this community is walking into a rapidly diversifying world where language skills, where cultural skills matter. The immigrant who comes from a refugee camp speaking a couple languages is ahead of the kid in the white suburban school. And the African American kid, whose family may have been here for many, many generations, but who comes from their neighborhood in North Minneapolis and takes a bus to go to Southwest and goes to their summer job somewhere else and goes somewhere else, as they shift codes throughout the day, that's exactly the skill that Cargill needs to send them into Southeast Asia where they're not part of the majority culture. The fact of the matter is, the ability to compete in a global environment exists exactly within the populations that are seen as down here. And I think one of the things that's really important as we approach these issues is to recognize that that's not just about what we're trying to create over here, but to really rethink the interventions that we have every step of the way. One of the great experiences I had this summer was to go to the Freedom School over in St. Paul. And it was just a great place, but it was very different than a traditional school. And I looked at the African American boys in that room on a summer day where their instruction was not shh, sit still, but to stand up, to make noise, to make rhythm, to move, to be part of the action. It was a really great experience and a really good way of talking about this culturally specific intervention was very much about succeeding. Now, after I read my story, they did this whole thing and this whole dance thing, and it was, then they went in this whole show us your stuff, and I was supposed to dance. This, ladies and gentlemen, was an achievement gap, as I said. But the fact of the matter is, that's exactly what we're talking about here. We're going somewhere different, every one of us. And so this really tough journey we have is also one of the most exciting journeys this community has ever taken. It's important to do that because I don't need to give the people in this room a speech on compassion. I know many of the people here, and I know that this is a deeply, deeply compassionate room. And we're the #1 volunteer community in America, and we do really compassionate things. But we also need to do something else. We need to mobilize vast parts of this population who think this is important, but it's not about them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is about every single person in this community, and if we get it right, it's not just fixing a problem, it's seizing our greatest opportunity. So with that, I want to just lay that on the table and open up for a conversation with one of the smartest, intimidating groups I've been in front of in a while. So let's...
We need to accommodate to understand the richness of the resources that are being brought to us.
Well, I think the first part of this is the idea of us being bicultural. When I first started going to schools as mayor, I did my very best to be the hip white guy who really tried to meet the African American student where they were at. I thought that was really the right thing for me to do. It became clear to me really, really soon that that was not why I was there. What I really needed to do was to help pass on some things that I knew that were the currency of interaction here, whether I liked it or not. I began to shake hands with every single kid in Minneapolis schools, and I made all of them do it. And I didn't do soul shakes, and I didn't do all of that. I made them stand there, look me in the eye, hold that hand really firmly, and tell me their name. Now, that could be interpreted as being a white thing. It happens to be the currency of interaction as you go into a business interview, and they need to know that. As I need to know what it is like to walk into a Somali room and not necessarily stick my hand out immediately to every woman, because some may choose that that is not what they're going to do. And I could give myriad of other examples. We have to be bicultural, tricultural, we have to be global citizens, okay? So that means a lot for what happens in schools. And again, I don't project myself to be the educator in the room, but I want to hold up when those things are done well. Superintendent Silva has taken on that issue in a really complex way in St. Paul, and it's tough work. Superintendent went about the idea of helping teachers and leadership go through culturally specific conversations, and it's tough. And I was at a very complicated community meeting where many people were very concerned about that. They took that, I mean, when you turn over the issue of race and behavior in education, that's kind of a big rock, okay? Let's be honest with each other. That gets all sorts of new issues out on the table. Superintendents turn that over, and in a very complex way is walking that through the community. I think that matters a lot. I mean, I heard one teacher who went through that said, this is so great, I learned so much in all this, but what does this have to do with my classroom? That's not the point. The point is that we all have to bring that directly into the classroom and directly into the out of school and directly into our neighborhood. So where the education system goes with that should be left to the educators. My job isn't to say, here is how to do that in St. Paul schools. It's to support and stand behind Superintendent Silva, though, when she takes that issue on. And suspensions is a whole other issue. I could get into it in much more depth.
Yeah. The job of Generation Next is not to tell the superintendents and the leaders of the charter schools how to run their schools internally.
You know, I probably stated that too quickly and not as precisely as I should. We're very interested and very engaged in what happens in the schools. I'm making clear that I'm not a person to put myself in the position of being a better expert at what works on literacy or not than a person who's the literacy lead for the districts.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. There's absolutely our role is to help determine what works in schools, but we're trying to do that two ways. One is as we walk into the individual schools, we're trying to do that with impatience and humility in equal parts. So what we'll do, for instance, when we walk into Lyndale schools, we'll meet with the principal, have a long meeting there about what she sees as the needs. We'll go over what we see the data shows. We then meet with the teachers and hear those issues. Then if we're invited back in, we go to the parent council, and then we go into classrooms and spend a lot of time learning. So we have, you know, before I was in this role, when I was as mayor, I articulated three things that I thought were really important in Minneapolis schools, and one was to, in underperforming schools, have longer hours, have the ability to hire teachers and leadership for reasons other than only seniority. I'm not saying throughout seniority, but I'm saying we've got to make sure we pick people who will succeed in leadership and teaching there. And then when teachers weren't succeeding, to remove them more quickly. I guess the final point that I made is that it was very important to diversify the teaching ranks, which was dramatically, well, nowhere nearly as diverse as we need to be. If you heard quickly all four of those things I say, all four of those were part of an agreement that the school board and the district came to in their partnership schools in Minneapolis. I'm thrilled about that. So now what that means, we've articulated the broad issue, and the district and the schools, and what's a real breakthrough, the district and the teachers, I should say, came through this. Now we've got to help make sure those partnership schools pay off. So we're standing ready with the districts in Minneapolis to say, okay, we'll help implement those partnership schools. You tell us what you need on it. So we were going to outcome, I guess. On that.
Well, and that's a good lead into this question, because you know, that last part of your presentation, talking about the need for multicultural intelligence,
yeah.
A lot of examples you used are things being done outside of school, out of school time things. Do you have examples of what's being done in schools to help the students, the faculty, the administration have this kind of multicultural intelligence impact the culture of the school?
Yeah, well, I think the most important work on that, I'm just going to go back to it quickly because it's important to underscore, is what Superintendent Silva, and I think Jean just walked in from the St. Paul School Board. I was just mentioning, I think the work that you're doing about the courageous conversations within St. Paul schools is one of the toughest political issues anybody's going to face in this community. It's one of the most important. So that, I would say, is absolutely the work that I think is the most important right now.
Okay. Here's a question. Given the availability of testing measurements from Minnesota Department of Education and the vast amount of national, regional, and local education outcome data, wouldn't it be more effective to filter precious funding away from additional research and data assessment to math and literacy programming in your pilot schools. So I'm assuming that this question says, instead of spending all this time on getting the right measurement stuff, couldn't we just focus it on the basic things you were talking about?
Yeah. I think the point is, shouldn't we just teach kids instead of decide whether they're learning or not? Is that kind of? I think there's a certain rationale to that, but I think there's a balance there that you've got to get right. I would say that coming into this work, many of you have been in this longer. I think the biggest gap in it is there's a fair amount of forensic data. What's wrong? There's not as much use of, there aren't as many tools available to instructors to be able to close that feedback loop and give real-time assessment about what is working and then adjust that and tie that together. I mean, the holy grail, it would seem, would be the ability of a teacher to lay out a lesson plan in the morning and be able to assess that and adjust in the afternoon and then pass that information on to an out-of-school partner. Wow, that seems impossible. It's actually not as distant as we think. The university's FAST program, have I got that right, is basically this 60 to 90 second quick assessment model that's being used in many other states. I think Iowa's using it and a number of others. And it's an early effort, and it's not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination as they portray it, but it is a way to get more of that assessment into the hands earlier. And I think that's what collectively we need to do is, a word that rightfully got the wrong reputation was tracking. Tracking was a really rotten thing that said to a kid really early, we saw something here and you're never going to get out of that track. But what we do, I believe, need to be able to do in school and out of school is not let any kid fall through the cracks. And that means being able to have these sort of assessments that are able to tell us how are our students doing in school and out of school, and be able to make sure that that we use data to make sure no kid falls through the cracks and hold up what's working. So for instance, that data that we're getting back about Lindale School doing a little better, correlating with the time when they've restructured the way those teachers go, could be a promising practice we've got to elevate.
Right.
And we can only do that if we get data.
One of the problems in both St. Paul and Minneapolis is high mobility.
Right.
And kids moving a lot. I think that in Minneapolis it's one in 6 move at least 3 times. Am I correct on that? 1 in 9. Anyway, it's a huge number. Yeah. And that's led, there's this idea of focused instruction now that tries to keep everybody moving kind of along the same path. There are some people that are concerned that it's kind of taking away the art of the good teacher who is able to flex in the classroom, individualize instruction. If the class needs a little more of this and a little more of that, needs to be supplemented with other materials, how do we deal with that?
Well, back when I was mayor, somebody said, what's the one thing you would do to solve the issues in North Minneapolis? And I said, that's really simple. I would ask everyone to please stop. Just stay right where you are for a generation and we'll work this whole thing out, okay? Well, that's not the way it works, because there happens to be massively high mobility, and that creates huge challenges. And when you think about this of a kid in a school, it has huge issues. Now, the first piece of that work that we're having the most impact on happens to be in the high school graduation area that I sort of skimmed over quickly. But what we're doing is working on connecting the system so that every young person develops a life plan with a trained adult. Right now, there's something called My Life Plan in Minneapolis, which involves students doing some work on a computer, laying out where they want to go. And St. Paul has the 7-year plan, happens to use the same computer program. It would be quite rich if we can connect these two systems, which isn't that hard. It's the same computer backend with the same strategies and the same goals for trusted adults, so that if the child moves from Washburn to Johnson, that record goes with them, and if that record includes which out-of-school interventions they have, we're able to track that through. That's not a holy grail, but it's better than nothing. And so I think we ought to be able to look at some of those issues. There's no question that mobility, however, is a huge complexity. And I think this plays into this issue of where people talk about, I happen to believe that we need to do a lot to fix the core system, and I happen to also believe that high-performing charters are effective. I think people, however, often talk about the marketplace of, if this school isn't working, we'll create another one and people will move. They don't recognize, while there's some some upside to that. The problem is that the mobility, moving a kid from here to there is different than me going from Target to Walmart. There's a larger consequence in all that, and we just have to factor in what the downside of mobility is.
Right.
So, sorry.
Okay, no, that's, the next question kind of has to do with, well, it does have to do with the way in Finland, the way they have developed their system so they bring the most resources to the schools that need it the most.
Right.
So this question is about, what's going on, unions and districts, about making sure that we send the most effective teachers to where they're really needed, and what are some of the barriers and what's being done to improve that?
Yeah. Well, first off, I think it's important to say that we have a situation where writ large, I mean, it's not universal, but writ large, our least trained teachers are teaching our kids most in need. Okay, now look at a totally different experience and put yourself in the mind of a teacher. Who's been a teacher in this room? Okay, so a lot of you, okay. So in any job, when you have worked there for a while, you get the right to be able to make more decisions about where you go. And in many cases, you will choose to go to a place where you feel you can succeed more. Okay, so you begin to look at, a system that rightfully in any place you say, I'm going to go over here and not there, but the system has created a situation where we have this situation where many of the most trained, talented teachers are not teaching our kids most in need. So faced with that situation, I think this partnership school model that, again, I give great credit to Dick and the board and the superintendent for doing, begins to look at that idea of how do we create incentives to go to those other schools, surrounded with community support. If there need to be longer hours there, but also have the smaller class sizes the teachers have talked about it, and create those incentives to bring those teachers into those schools, I think matters a lot. So it went into the contract negotiations, and we'll see how it's implemented, but I give you guys credit for at least unpacking what's one of the most complicated issues out there.
There's another question here that has to do kind of with language and its impact on how people see themselves and how other people look at them. And that's when we talk about the achievement gap, we're really measuring quantitative and qualitative measurements.
Yeah.
And it can lead to this idea that Minnesota would be a great place if we just didn't have all these people who have that problem.
Yeah, or a bunch of white people got stupid.
Yeah.
That'd close the gap.
And
That's not a good idea.
so, it's even here with our group, we know now that it's not just the achievement gap. That's an iceberg. The achievement gap is the top of an opportunity culture gap.
Yeah.
And how can we change this language? You described your own gap when you were asked to dance there at Harambe at Freedom
That's
School.
a pretty lame example, but yeah.
But it is a sense in which is the gap really the achievement gap, or is the gap we as white folks who haven't figured out how to work with people so everybody can see? Don't we have an achievement gap as well?
Yeah, the language in this whole area is incredibly important, and for 9 months we talk about that issue almost every day, and there's not a language that works right now. We haven't found it. Achievement gap is important to hold up because there are statistics that are achingly difficult to come to terms with, but they need us to understand what the problem is. Opportunity gap is probably a little better because it really goes to the fact that the achievement gap seems to put the onus on kids who already start with less. Why are we making it all their responsibility? Opportunity gap's a little better language. Gap is kind of a weird thing. Is that really what we're trying to do here? Aren't we trying to raise everybody up? And so I got to tell you, after 9 months in the work and a lot before that, and trying to talk about this, I haven't figured out the right way to talk about this. I do think part of the core question that you have there is where is the responsibility? That's kind of one of the things I took out of that. And the issue is, I think the discussion of this is often put in terms of putting the onus on the kid who is not succeeding as much as we want them to. And it's irrational to think that a little child walking into this world with odds stacked wildly against them is 100% responsible for solving that problem. This is a world that we throw our kids into, and we have to figure out a way to help them succeed.
RT, you brought up the fact that there are corporations that are involved on your board who are making this shift themselves to understand they need multicultural intelligence. Are some of those corporations maybe helping school districts to understand what it took for them to make this shift, and could the school districts learn from some of these corporations?
Yeah, it's interesting to raise this whole issue of business in general because there's a whole lot of energy around that whole thing. There's whole polluted national discussion about intransigent teachers unions and corporate reformers and all this stuff. This is not a helpful conversation. It does not reflect the reality that I see on the ground here. I don't know what the heck it is all around the country. I know what it is in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I know I happen to be in an organization that has all of those groups in the tent. So I work with the teachers unions on different issues, both the city and the state one. I work with the business leaders on these issues. There are many business leaders at very different places on it, many who say, I can't deal with the districts, it's too complicated, I'm only going to deal with high-performing charters. There's that group. There's also groups that are deeply engaged in the schools. I think part of your question was, can that performance-based mentality be brought into some of this work? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Can this be run like a factory? No. And so, I think there needs to be that. And I used to wrestle with that a lot in government because I really valued the fact that we got a lot of businesses coming in and helping, but I made it clear that government and business are a little different. And this isn't just like government. We ran a complicated operation. People cared about potholes. They really cared about their kids. It's just a whole different deal,
I think what the questioner was asking was more about how corporations are making the cultural shift within their organizational culture.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How could they help schools learn about what it takes to change the culture to be a multicultural?
I get it. I'm sorry. Yeah, totally different question then. I had a great experience in starting the Step Up Summer Job Program because we needed desperately to get jobs for kids. But as we did that, and in partnership with Richard Davis, we rarely went in and said, you need to help these poor kids that need a job. We made this whole pitch about globalism, et cetera, and 20,000 kids later, 86% kids of color, more than 30% from immigrant families, we have put a whole generation into all these different businesses. And after giving all these kids jobs, they come back and say thank you. It's a great thing. Because the fact of the matter is, what we've done is diversified their ranks. I was at the minority recruitment committee for a large accounting firm here a few years back. And it was a really great lunch, and they were these people were super earnest and well-intentioned. There wasn't a person of color in the room, and they said, what can we do to get more accountants of color? And I said, grow them. Hire them for Step Up. And they did. And now they're moving within that system. We have this amazing pipeline, 20,000 kids, 86% kids of color in all the best businesses. And so many of them have opened their doors because these kids have opened the doors. So I think one of the things that happens is if you have this asset-based way of looking at the community, it's a very different thing. Now, that feels very different often in a school and in a classroom, where there's a huge challenge of equity and income and neighborhood and family dysfunction all put together in large doses within a classroom. And we ask a teacher to try to unpack all of that. Okay, it's very different than trying to get a kid or two of color into this accounting firm. So what we've really got to say is, with all of that on top, can't we do more to solve some of those other problems so the teacher can teach? So that's why at Generation Next, we're engaged in trying to develop outside partners to help on the community services and trying to hold up the issue of housing equity and all that kind of thing. The final point is, we ask our kids to do all the tough work that we don't do. The issue of there was what was I reading the other day about Eden Prairie? There wasn't a single affordable housing unit built in Eden Prairie in the past since 2002. Okay, and that happens to be a pretty progressive suburb, all things considered. The fact of the matter is, we have massive housing segregation, and I know what kind of a fight I had getting affordable housing into a couple neighborhoods that were not impacted in the city of Minneapolis. Our kids can't solve this problem for us. Okay, and so the fact of the matter is, this has to be tied to a whole set of issues in the city in the metropolitan area that has the lowest metropolitan unemployment of any metropolitan area in the country. Lowest right here. We also have the biggest equity gap, so there's a problem.
Yeah. You know. This is a clarifying question that somebody asked about geography. I think, as I understand, for now, Generation Next is just working with Minneapolis and St. Paul, not the suburbs yet, right?
Yeah, right now we're working with Minneapolis, St. Paul, and that's a great debate. And we're not sure where to go with all that because we really have our hands full, okay, with these two wonderful districts. I love working it, but that's a lot, you know. And I was out talking to Roseville schools, and they're doing great work, and I was out talking to Stillwater schools, and I was out in the western suburbs where they're doing an initiative. What we're trying to do is to inspire complementary work and see how that gets done. Blandon's been funding some work around the state, which has been really good, and so we're wrestling with all of that. When we're smart enough to figure this out, we'll try to figure out how to help everybody else.
The next question has to do really with healthcare. I mean, I was shocked to learn that one of the major reasons that poor kids miss school is their teeth, dental care. And I've talked to principals in the St. Paul public schools. I think it's like some schools only get a nurse 1 day a week. And this question is a concern about the importance of health from pre-birth, you know, all the way through school. How can we deal with that gap around health care to make sure all the kids are as healthy as possible as they're going through school?
Yeah. Well, I think, Mayor, you were the ones who started the community-based clinics, am I right? I think you did, yeah. And if not you, it sounds like it. So, Mayor Fraser, am I right? You were there, weren't you?
He certainly heard it.
Oh.
A lot of it in the school-based.
Okay. Okay, so I'm talking to two people who know more about the genesis of this than I did. So the cities don't usually do this, but the city of Minneapolis is actually engaged in that. The county has done some really good work, but during the tornado, the county opened up point services, you know, a single person with the support services within all those schools in North Minneapolis, and boy, did they need that back then. But if you start and think about connecting those two models a little bit, boy, isn't that an exciting kind of thought here. So I think there's sort of a germ of something that could happen.
You know, you brought up the concern about language. I believe at the last legislative session, the legislature came up with policy that we wanted to find a way to sustain the home language of students because that's an asset, not a deficit.
Yeah.
And this question also has, kids learn much better before puberty than they do afterwards. You know, what can we do in terms of enhancing language maintenance and language instruction? This is a concern of mine. My wife directs the Center for Advanced Research and Language Acquisition at the U.
There we go.
Our daughter is a Spanish immersion student. But one of the challenges for immersion schools, some of you out there will know this, it's getting people who really speak the language well and who are really effective teachers.
Yeah. Well, because of your wife's work, you probably know this in much more depth than I do, but I remember Richard Green's school about 10 years ago has always been very, very low on the reading list, and it had started to come up a little bit, so I went out there to just kind of see what was going on. And they talked a lot about teaching language, teaching reading in the native language. And that was during the whole post 9/11 attack immigrants sort of thing. So that was a controversial issue. But you know, they made the very clear point to me that you only learn reading once. So you better learn it in the language where you're the most competent. And that's a pretty simple point that's hugely important. Who teaches it in a place like this? So one of the challenges we have is I think there are like 90 Latino students, teachers in the Minneapolis schools, and that's not unique. We really desperately need to diversify this teaching corps. One of the things I know that both districts are looking at is that a really wonderful well of potential on that as quickly as possible is that the teaching assistants within these districts are very diverse. And so using that as more of a pipeline to train those teachers, those teaching assistants to become teachers. Now the problem is you're often dealing with people who aren't getting paid a whole lot, so you're saying, well, take a couple years off to get your degree and maybe a couple more for a master's. So we've got to think of these alternative strategies to get people there. The superintendent of Minneapolis schools came with, she was a banker who came in an alternative pathway. I think, Gene, did Superintendent Silva come from a non-traditional background too?
Superintendent Silva started as an EA.
Oh, okay. Okay, so they had two paths that were different, but I think both of them represent that we've got to get a little more creative about the pipeline.
Especially with Valeria, she came without English.
Yeah.
So here's a question about the challenge of possibly lengthening the day and lengthening the school year. We know that's done. Jeffrey Canada, Harlem Children's Zone, they lengthen it. Superintendent Silva and Jean can help me with this. I think Valeria told me if we added a day, it's like $1 million a day to add to the school year.
Yeah.
So what are the chances of lengthening and giving kids more time?
Well, when you talk to teachers, one of the first things they'll say, aside from the fact that you're asking me to raise the child and do all these other things, which is a very legitimate concern, is there's so much I'm being asked to do, I don't have time to do it. And Minneapolis, for instance, had one of the shortest school days in the state, and then a couple of years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, added 5 more days. I might have that sort of right. Remember last year when it was so cold?
Yeah.
All of them were lost. Okay, stop and think about what that means. I happen to be an advocate for more days in school, and I'm happy these partnership schools, that's one of the things on the table. But I also know that one of the things that is a pretty commonly accepted point right now is that it's not just classroom time, it's different time outside as well. I'm not saying instead of, but as well. And so all of this work we're doing at Generation Next and trying to unify all of these out-of-school strategies and do a better job of tying them to the knowledge in school with those students is about that. That, you know, they're 24 hours a day, and let's let the kids sleep, but let's also do a better job of using the full day to make sure they've got more learning opportunities. I get the fact that one of the great ways for kids to discover is freedom to simply walk around in the summer and have unplanned work, and I do think we overschedule kids, but when we're dealing with the populations we're dealing with and the options that they have, I would rather err on the side of having quality interventions than having the blank slates where there is not the kind of enrichment that we do. I get the fact that there are plenty of kids being driven by their mom to 27 different things in the summer, and that's kind of over-programming. We're dealing with something very, very different in some very highly impacted neighborhoods with some kids who face some really rotten choices when they don't have one of those good opportunities.
So, you know, the work that's being done by Generation Next is really trying to enhance, you know, all of this out-of-school time effort, so kids have opportunities that are more equitable.
Yeah.
But it's really a challenge, having been the director of a nonprofit before, to get the resources to make sure that American Indian students will have the same chances to travel around the country, to go to museums, to have dancing lessons, to have all this other stuff that middle class and above kids have. As you meet with your group, are the funders looking at, I mean, is there a study to know how much do we need to do to make sure there really is equity in terms of out-of-school time, quality out-of-school time opportunities for all children?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest arguments and discussions, you know, policy arguments that I hear about all this is what is around the word dosage. How much is enough? How much is too much sometimes? You know, so that I think is probably the single biggest thing that people are focused on. How do we fund all this? You know, one of the things that's really kind of incredibly great, but a little challenging in this community is I've often said the land of 10,000 lakes is the land of 10,000 organizations and nonprofits, that we probably need to do a better job of having people working together, and in some cases, having groups collaborate. I remember about a year and a half ago when I was sitting in the mayor's office, and within about a 10-day period, about 4 or 5 different groups came to me with a capital request for doing something on Broadway and Emerson. The Cookie Cart, Emerge with the Historic Library in North Minneapolis, Juxtaposition, which is an amazing arts organization, Rev Academy, this great new group doing computer work. And I finally just asked them all to come in. I said, look, I think you guys are all collectively great, but the idea is collectively. Do we really want to take our kids and put them down one of these paths And so they came back with a plan that was really great to put those together. So the child had a summer experience where they were going from the entrepreneurial cookie cart to the artistic juxtaposition to the technology at Emerge to the computer-based work at Rev Academy. And General Mills funded that, and it was really, really a great effort. More of that, I think, is really helpful.
Great. This question comes with, how is Generation Next trying to overcome a possible perception that this is kind of, again, another outside group telling teachers how to do their job? So how are you connecting with the actual practitioners out there to give the sense that this is truly a joint effort to do this?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think the short answer is watch us do our work. When we were going to Lindale School and we're walking into that, we were meeting with the teachers and we said, we're not going to come in here unless we're invited. So we walked through what we wanted, listen to that. And so one teacher asked us a question very much like that. And our response was, the relationship between a teacher and a student is sacred. Our job is not to get in the middle of that, but our job is to ask, what would you do if you knew that you had the entire community behind you, but not breathing down your neck? What would you do? And so we tried to paint that image, and that's what we've tried to do. So we've done a lot of listening, we've done a lot of learning and all of that. There will be some teachers who won't accept that, but so far, so good, actually. I think there's a lot of arrogance with people saying that they can do so much better than these professionals who've been out on the point. And I believe there are some teachers who are not effective, just as there are some people I don't think I could vouch for every one of the 3,400 people who worked for me at the city of Minneapolis. There are people succeeding and not, and if the taxpayers are paying for them, we should hold them to high standards. If our kids are at stake, we should hold them to high standards. So I think we especially need the ability for those kids who are not performing to get the very best instruction they can get, and we need those teachers to know that they have a lot of community support.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a facetious question, but nowadays the profession teacher kind of gets minimized.
Yeah.
The people who make a lot of money are coaches. Coaches make tons of money, but actually aren't teachers nowadays really coaches trying to help students improve their skills and their gifts, just like a football coach is trying to work with the line and the backs and the people trying to do this. And this raises a question to me about, again, if we're measuring just qualitative and quantitative, and we look around and there's music, there's art, there's drama, there are other things. And this hit me because some of my closest friends were actually only mediocre students in school. Mm-hmm. And they've made more money than my wife and I would make in 2 lifetimes. So what were the gifts and the talents that these folks had that didn't ever get measured in school? And are we missing things? And is there a way that as students go through school, they can always know, thinking of Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, they have areas where they are superior, where they are good, and there isn't always this feeling I'm a deficit, but there are other areas that I'm really good at, getting along with people, whatever.
Well, yeah, 2 parts of it. The first part of it was this whole issue of teachers and the impression we have of them. And for those of you who worry about us downgrading the teaching profession, I think we did that for many, many years. As tough as the discussion and the debate has been, and as destructive as I think it is sometimes, we're in a really good period where people are paying attention to teachers, and I think we're finally getting the elevation of the profession that it deserves. The second part about these students and all of that, frankly, let me just speak from my personal experience. I was an extremely poor student. I came in 50th in a class of 52. I did. And it wasn't funny. I was really, really not good in school, and I left high school thinking I was really stupid. And yet I had a few trusted adults in my life who said to me, you are worth something, what you say matters. And when I got into another environment, when I got into college, I soared. It just worked. And I don't know what that was exactly, but I know that there was something that wasn't working for me in that. And so I try to bring that experience into this because I do think that, and I think every teacher has a story about that kid who's just not succeeding, and somehow you look them in the eye and you know there's a spark there and you find it. So I think one of the things that's also important with all these measurements, and I'm talking about measuring reading by third grade and math and high school graduation, there's some kids who don't fit in the box. And that's just okay, as long as we recognize you never throw a kid away.
Great, thank you, Artie. I've got a bunch. I've done almost all of these questions here. I think I want to ask a question about you've given us basically the purpose and the plan for Generation Next. When can we expect to hear from Generation Next about how things are working, how they're working, what the barriers are, how we're trying to deal with those barriers? Is that going to be in June? Is that going to be next fall? When is that going to be?
Yeah. So what I did at the beginning is walk through the three most important actions that we're doing. What we're doing in trying to hold up the screening for every 3-year-old, to unify the partners on reading and then move that into the district, to unify all the out-of-school collaborators and have every young person develop a life plan with a trusted adult. Over the short term, we will be reporting inputs into that. How many kids are screened, how many tutors are working together, how many young people are getting a life coach. And the fact that we don't like to do that because we want to get outputs. How are we closing the achievement gap? And we'll continue to bring that out as much as we can, along with what's everybody else doing out there to get it done. So the good news is this afternoon, if you want to, you can go to our website, and instead of releasing an annual report, we have a very robust website with data that we're going to continue to update. We're not going to do it once a year. It's just real time and to get that out. There will always be data growing on that. And in our partnership with the schools, we hope there'll be even more of that. And then we'll be giving you benchmarks on each of those things that I mentioned ongoing as they're working.
And can I ask you a question about, will the website perhaps have listing of all these partner organizations in case people out here want to get involved in your effort? How could they go and find a particular nonprofit or something where they could get involved in working to?
I skipped over that, and I should have. Thanks for throwing me that softball. Along with all the complexity on this, every single person in this community can do something. You can talk to a family about getting a 3-year-old screened. You can read to a kid, and you can be a life coach. On those two issues about reading to a kid and a life coach, in about 3 weeks, you'll go to our website and you'll get a list of the organizations that have been participating in the Generation Next work and who've agreed to these common practices. So very simply, we'll say, if you want to read to a kid, go to the Generation Next website and look at a list of the organizations there and we'll put you in touch. If you want to be a graduation coach, do that. So the super simple message is read to a kid, help them graduate, go to the Generation Next website, and we'll give you some names to do that.
Thank you, everyone. Please.